chain around her neck was too short to let her stand. She had been in that position for 3 days, kneeling on the cold metal floor of the trading vessel, wrists bound behind her back, a collar pressing against the base of her throat so tight she had learned to breathe in shallow pulls. Her name was Lyra. She was Valorian, one of the tall, silver-skinned species from the Outer Rim, built for speed and endurance and open sky. She had not seen open sky in 11 months. The market on Station Keth 9 was the kind of place that existed in the cracks between galactic laws. The Coalition looked the other way. The merchant guilds paid the right people the right amounts, and creatures like Lyra ended up in cages bolted to the floors of repurposed cargo ships, tagged with a number instead of a name. Her tag read, Lot 114. The auctioneer was a thick-necked Barathi named Gruul, who smelled like engine grease and wore too many rings. He moved down the row of lots with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. He did not look at faces. He looked at condition ratings on his data pad. He pressed a scanner to Lyra's collar and read the number aloud to the small crowd gathered in the bay. Lot 114. Valorian female. Age approximate. Secondary market acquisition. Some behavioral notes on file. The behavioral notes were that she had bitten one of Gruul's handlers when they tried to move her without warning. She did not regret it. The crowd was the usual collection. Cargo haulers looking for cheap labor. A research firm rep with clean gloves and a cooler expression than anyone else in the room. 2 Barathi males who kept whispering to each other. And in the back, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and a paper cup of something hot in one hand. A human. Lyra had seen humans before. Not many. They were a young species, noisy, prone to opinions, not well regarded by the older galactic powers. They had only had faster-than-light travel for about 60 years. Most of the galaxy considered them a curiosity at best and an annoyance at most. This one was tall for a human, though not remarkable by any other standard. Dark hair going gray at the sides. Worn jacket with a patch on the shoulder that meant nothing to her. He was watching the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read. Not eager, not bored. Something else. His name was Cal Duran. He was 43 years old. He had been a field medic in the Human Colonial Corps for 12 years, then a contractor, then something harder to define. He was on Keth 9 because a contact had sent him coordinates and a message that said only, "You should see this." Cal had seen it. He was still deciding what to do about what he was seeing. Gruul started the bidding on Lot 112, a young Krethian male who kept his eyes on the floor. Cal watched. He did not bid. He drank his cooling coffee and he watched. When the hammer came down on Lot 112 and the Krethian was led away by the research rep with the clean gloves, something in Cal's jaw tightened. He had seen a lot of things in his life. War zones, field surgeries with no proper equipment, colonies that the Coalition had decided were not worth defending. But there was something about the matter-of-fact quiet of this room, the way Gruul read the numbers like grocery prices, that landed differently than anything had in a long time. Gruul reached Lot 114. Lyra did not raise her eyes. She had learned that looking at the crowd made it worse. She stared at the floor plate 3 inches in front of her knees, and she breathed the way she had taught herself, slow and controlled, pulling air past the pressure of the collar. The bidding opened low. The research rep checked something on a tablet and shook her head. One of the Barathi males made an offer. The other shook his head and pulled him back. The first Barathi raised it slightly. Cal set down his cup. He raised his hand. The number he said was 3 times the Barathi's offer. The room went quiet in that particular way. Rooms go quiet when someone has decided to end a conversation. Gruel looked at him with the flat assessment of someone calculating whether this was real. Cal met his eyes and did not blink. The Borathy did not counter. The hammer came down. Gruel's assistant moved toward Lyra with the transfer lead. Lyra flinched back, the instinct buried too deep to suppress, and the assistant yanked the lead to correct her. Cal was across the room in 4 steps. He did not raise his voice. He put his hand on the assistant's wrist, not hard, just present, and said in Galactic standard, "I'll take it from here." The assistant looked at Gruel. Gruel shrugged. The assistant let go. Cal crouched down in front of Lyra. He was at eye level with her. She finally looked up because the silence was strange, and what she saw was a face that was not calculating anything. He said, in rough but functional Valorian, "I'm going to take the collar off. Is that all right?" She stared at him. No one had asked her if anything was all right in 11 months. She didn't answer. She couldn't find the words anywhere in her chest. But she didn't pull back, and Cal took that as the answer it was. He reached into his jacket for a multi-tool, found the collar's secondary release, and the pressure around her throat disappeared. Lyra pulled her first real breath in 3 days. It tasted like recycled station air and old metal, and it was the best thing she had ever felt. Cal stood up. He looked at Gruel's assistant still hovering nearby and said, in Borathy, which he spoke badly but clearly enough, "The wrist restraints too." They came off. Lyra sat on the floor of the cargo bay with her hands free and her throat free, and she did not move, because she did not yet know what this was, or what it cost, or what came next. She had learned not to assume that better meant safe. Cal did not rush her. He picked up his paper cup, found it empty, and set it on a nearby crate. He looked at the floor next to her rather than at her. He said, in Valorian again, "My ship is docked at Bay 7. You don't have to come. But if you want somewhere to sit, that isn't this. The offer is open." He walked toward the exit. Lyra looked at the floor where the collar had been. She looked at the door. She looked at the remaining lots in their chains and felt something old and heavy move through her chest. She stood up. Her legs held. She followed him. Cal's ship was called the Ardent. It was a mid-range hauler, the kind that carried legitimate cargo 3/4 of the time, and complicated questions the other quarter. It was clean in the way that working ships are clean, which is to say, functional and honest about its use. He led her to the medical bay first, which was small but properly stocked. He gestured at the examination table without requiring her to use it, and pulled a portable scanner from a drawer. Lyra stood in the doorway and watched him. He said, "I'm not going to scan you without your permission, but I'd like to check the collar sight. Those things cause nerve compression when they're worn long enough." She said, in Galactic standard because her Valorian was rusty from disuse, "You speak my language badly." He looked up. One corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he said, "I do. I learned it from a database 3 years ago. A friend told me I should." She said, "Why?" He set the scanner down on the counter. He looked at her directly, the same way he had in the bay, without calculation. "Because your species was being registered in secondary markets at an increasing rate," he said. "And I thought if I was ever in a position to do something about that, I should be able to communicate." Lyra had spent 11 months reading the intentions of everyone around her as a survival necessity. She was good at it. She stood in the doorway and read Cal Duran and found something she did not have a ready category for. And he was not performing kindness. He was not managing her. He was simply being straightforward in the way some humans apparently were, blunt and practical, and entirely absent of the particular cruelty of false gentleness. She walked to the examination table and sat on it. He scanned the collar site without touching her skin, which she noted. The scanner beeped in a minor way. He studied the readout. "Some compression," he said. "Not permanent. I have something that will help." He opened a cabinet, found a small applicator, and held it out to her handle. First, so she could take it herself. She took it. "The instructions are on the side," he said in Valorian. "Badly." She looked at the label. She applied it herself. The ache she had been carrying in her neck for so long she'd stopped noticing it began, slowly, to ease. Cal moved to the small galley adjacent to the medical bay and started making something. She listened to the sounds of it. Water, heat, the click of containers. He did not narrate what he was doing or explain himself. He just did it, and after a few minutes he came back with 2 cups and set one on the counter within her reach. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Tea. Valorian sourced. I keep it because the same friend who told me to learn the language told me your people use it for decompression. It helps regulate the secondary nervous system after stress." Lyra looked at the cup. She looked at him. She said, "You have a very informed friend." He said, "She's thorough." Lyra picked up the cup. The smell was correct. The deep mineral warmth of telin root, which she had not tasted since home. She did not cry. She was past crying and had been for a long time. But she held the cup in both hands and felt something in her chest that had been clenched for 11 months begin, by the smallest degree, to open. Cal sat across from her on a supply crate. He wrapped both hands around his own cup. Here he said, "I'm not going to ask you anything right now. You can sleep in the second bunk. The door locks from the inside. Tomorrow we can talk about where you want to go." She said, "You bought me." He said, "I paid a transaction fee to remove you from a situation. That's different from buying a person." She said, "The law does not make that distinction." He said, "I'm aware. That's a problem with the law." She watched him. She said, "What do you want from me?" He said, "Nothing. I want to get you somewhere you can decide what happens next. After that, whatever you do with your life is yours." Lyra had been prepared for conditions. She had been preparing her negotiating position since the moment he crouched in front of her in the bay. She had expected to trade something, service or labor or information. She had a list of things she could offer. She had been running the calculus since the collar came off. She had not prepared for nothing. Only she said, "That is not how this works." He said, "I know. I'm telling you how it works on my ship." She did not respond. She drank the tea. The telin root did what it was supposed to do, and she felt the long, locked muscles of her shoulders begin their slow descent from her ears. Cal finished his tea, rinsed the cup, and said good night in Valorian, so mangled that despite everything, despite the 11 months and the collar and the cargo bay floor, Lyra felt something close to a laugh move through her. She did not let it out, but she felt it. She went to the second bunk. She locked the door from the inside. She lay on a surface that was flat and clean and not a floor, and she stared at the ceiling of the Ardent and listened to the sounds of a ship she did not know, reading its rhythms the way she had learned to read every new cage. This one had a locked door she controlled. She was still awake 3 hours later when she heard Cal moving in the cockpit, checking departure protocols, filing the exit paperwork with Keith 9 Station Authority. She heard him argue, briefly and with controlled irritation, with someone on the comms about documentation. She could not hear the words, but she could hear the tone, and the tone was the same as it had been in the cargo bay. Not performing, not managing, just a person doing the next thing that needed doing. She closed her eyes. Sleep came for the first time in weeks that felt like rest instead of just unconsciousness. The Ardent moved through the outer rim at standard cruise, no dramatic acceleration, no reason to hurry. Cal had filed a course for a way station called Port Len, 4 days out, where he said there was a Valorian resettlement contact he trusted. Lyra had not agreed to this yet. She had also not disagreed, unless she was still in the process of deciding how much of her own future she was willing to handle at one time. On the second day, she came out of the bunk room and sat in the co-pilot seat without asking. Cal looked at the seat, looked at her, and slid the secondary display toward her so she could see the nav readout. She was a navigator. Had been on a Valorian long-range vessel before the ambush. She did not say this. She looked at the display and found 3 small inefficiencies in the plotted course and said nothing about those either. On the third day, she said, "Your course has 3 inefficiencies." Cal said, "I know. I left them in because I wasn't sure if you wanted to go to Port Len." She turned to look at him. He was watching the stars with the easy attention of a man comfortable with long silences. She said, "You plotted a slow route on purpose." He said, "I plotted a route that gave you time. If you want to go somewhere else, tell me and we'll adjust." Lyra looked at the nav display. 11 months of other people making every decision about where her body went and what happened to it. The feeling of being offered a choice was so unfamiliar, it registered in her chest as something almost like pain before it sorted itself into something else. She said, "Tell me about the contact at Port Len." He told her. Her name was Davy Oren, a human Valorian coalition worker who had been running resettlement cases for 6 years. Cal had worked with her twice before. He described her with the specific and unflattering affection of someone who genuinely respected the person they were describing. And Lyra found herself building a picture of a woman who argued loudly and showed up reliably. She said, "And if I go to Port Len and meet this Davy Oren and decide I don't want what she's offering," and Cal said, "then we leave and figure out something else." "We," she said. He paused. He said, "I meant that you would have options." She said, "You said we." He looked at the stars. He said, "I'm not great at staying uninvolved once I'm involved." Lyra had spent 11 months developing a very precise understanding of what people meant versus what they said. She ran Cal Duran's record again in her mind. The cargo bay, the collar, the tea, the locked door, the slow course. None of it required anything from her. She said, "I was a navigator before." He said, "I know. I read the behavioral file Gruel had on you. It mentioned your former vessel registration." She said, "And you still bought a navigator when you clearly know how to fly." He said, "I didn't buy a navigator. I told you that." She said, "You knew what I was before you bid." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." The stars moved past the viewport at cruise speed, slow and permanent and indifferent to the conversation happening in front of them. Lyra turned back to the nav display. She pulled the secondary interface toward her, isolated the 3 inefficiencies, and began correcting the course. Cal watched the display update and said nothing. She corrected the first 2. On the third, she paused. She said, "What do you haul?" "On this ship," he said. "Depends on the run. Medical supplies to undersupported colonies, and sometimes people who need to move without a formal record." sometimes information. She said, complicated questions. He said, usually yes. She completed the third correction. The Ardent's estimated arrival at Port Len moved up by 11 hours. She set the interface back to neutral. She said, I want to meet Davy Oren. He said, all right. She said, and then I want to talk about what complicated questions look like from the co-pilot seat. Mikal turned to look at her for the first time in the conversation. The expression on his face was the same, unperforming steadiness, as always. But there was something else under it. The particular quiet of someone who has been hoping for something and is trying not to show it. He said, I think that's a conversation worth having. Port Len was a mid-sized way station with a reputation for minding its own business, which made it useful. Davy Oren met them at Docking Bay 4 and was exactly what Cal had described. She was short, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had been filing paperwork in difficult conditions for so long that the paperwork had stopped being a burden and become a weapon. She took one look at Lyra and said, in perfect Valorian, without preamble, you don't have to do anything today. There's a place to stay and a meal and a doctor who has worked with your people before. Everything else is optional until you say otherwise. Lyra stood on the dock and felt the weight of the last 11 months pressing against the inside of her ribs. She said, Cal said you argue loudly. Davy looked at Cal. Cal looked at the ceiling. Davy said, he's not wrong. Does that bother you? Lyra said, no. She walked with Davy toward the station. At the end of the docking ramp, she stopped and turned back. Cal was standing by the Ardent's ramp with his hands in his jacket pockets, he not following, giving her the space she hadn't asked for but apparently needed. She said, the course to Sector 9 has 4 good options. I left the analysis in the secondary nav system. He looked at her. He said, I'll take a look. She turned and kept walking. Behind her, she heard the Ardent's ramp close. She heard Cal's boots on the dock going back up toward the ship. And she knew he was going to read the nav analysis. And she knew what she had put inside it. Not just course options, but call frequencies and a notation on the third option that said, this one is fastest if you need me quickly. She did not look back again. But she walked a little taller than she had in 11 months, and Davy Oren, who had been doing this work long enough to know what that cost, said nothing and matched her pace and led her towards something that was not a cage. The resettlement office at Port Len smelled like old paper and recycled coffee, and a particular kind of industrial cleaner that Lyra would later associate with the beginning of things. Davy Oren's office was 3 rooms of organized chaos, stacked with files and data pads, and a small plant on the windowsill that had survived against all odds. Lyra sat across from Davy's desk and answered questions for 2 hours. Not the kind of questions she had been asked for 11 months, which were about compliance and value and categorization. These were questions about where she was from and what she needed and what she wanted to happen next. She was not used to the last one. She answered it badly the first time, gave a practical response about documentation and transit clearance, and Davy wrote it down without judgment and then said, and personally, what do you want? Lyra looked at the plant on the windowsill. It was some kind of earth variety, green and stubborn and entirely out of place in a way station office. She said, I want to go back to navigation. Real navigation, not cargo runs, exploration class. Davy wrote that down too. She said, that's going to take time. The certifications have to be reissued. Your previous records were flagged when you went missing, and there's a process for restoring them. It's irritating and bureaucratic, but it's possible. Lyra said, how long? Davy said, 6 months if we push. A year if we don't. And Lyra said, "We push." Davi looked up from her notes. The corner of her mouth moved. She said, "Good." They worked through the documentation for 3 hours. Lyra's secondary nervous system, still recovering from the collar compression, gave her a persistent headache that she managed by focusing harder on the work. By the end of the 3rd hour, she had a temporary resettlement ID, a bunk in the station's protected housing block, and an appointment with the Valorian medical specialist Davy had mentioned. Davi walked her to the housing block and said, at the door, "Cal checks in every 2 weeks on a standard rotation. If you want to send him a message earlier, I have his frequency." Lyra said, "I left it in his nav system." Davy said, "Of course you did." She paused at the door. She said, "He talks about you." "Not often. But when he does, it sounds like someone describing a person they're proud to know." And Lyra looked at the door. She said, "He barely knows me." Davy said, "He knew enough to be in that cargo bay." Lyra did not answer. She went inside. The room was small and plain and had a window that looked out over the station's outer ring, where you could see the docking bays and, if you looked at the right angle, the black between the stars where ships moved in and out of range. She stood at the window for a long time. The medical appointment was the next morning. The doctor's name was Pell, a Valorian male who had been practicing on Port Len for 8 years and greeted her in full formal Valorian, the kind spoken in the high cities, which she had not heard since before the ambush, and which hit her somewhere in the chest she had not expected. He reviewed Cal's scanner data and confirmed the collar compression was responding to the treatment. He gave her a revised course of medication and a set of exercises for the cervical nerve group. And then he sat back and said, in the quieter register, "The physical recovery is the straightforward part. The rest of it takes longer. I can refer you to someone who specializes in the rest, if you want." She said, "Is it the same someone everyone gets referred to?" He said, "No. I make a specific recommendation based on the person. For you, I would suggest a woman named Sarah Voss. She worked in coalition trauma services for 15 years. She has the quality of not making things worse when you talk about them." Aunt Lyra considered this. She said, "Does she talk too much?" He said, "She talks exactly as much as the situation requires." Lyra said, "Give me the referral." She met Sarah Voss that afternoon. Sarah was a human woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and the manner of someone who had heard a great many hard things and had learned to hold them without flinching. She said, at the start of the session, "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. We can talk about navigation charts if you prefer. I found that people often get to the things that matter by way of the things that don't." Lyra said, "That sounds like a strategy." Sarah said, "It is. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Lyra said, "I appreciate that." They talked about navigation for 40 minutes, and then, without deciding to, Lyra talked about the ambush. Not in detail. In the compressed minimum that her instincts allowed. Sarah did not push for more, and she asked a single question at the end of the 40 minutes, and it was, "Is there anything right now that you need that you don't have?" Lyra thought about it. She said, "I need to feel useful. Doing nothing makes the other things louder." Sarah said, "Then we make sure you're doing something." The next morning, Davi put Lyra to work in the resettlement office. Filing, translation, reviewing incoming case files, and flagging the ones that needed urgent processing. Lyra sat at a desk in the corner of Davy's organized chaos and worked. And the work was, as Sarah had predicted, exactly the right volume at which to drown out the things she was not ready to face yet. 12 days into her stay at Port Len, Cal's ship appeared on the docking registry. Lyra was at her desk in Davy's office when Davy mentioned it, casually, while reviewing a file. She said, "The Ardent is in Bay 4, if you want to know." Lyra kept her eyes on the file she was reviewing. She said, "I know, I was watching the registry." Davy said, "Of course you were." Cal came to the office 2 hours later. He stood in the doorway with his jacket and his slightly tired expression and said, "The nav analysis was excellent. Saved me 11 hours. Lyra said, "I know. I tracked the adjusted arrival times." He said, "Of course you did." She looked up from her file. He looked the same as he had on the Ardent, unhurried and unperforming. She said, "How was the run?" He said, "Complicated." "In the usual way." She said, "Sit down. I want to tell you about the 3 cases I flagged this week. 2 of them are on stations you passed through." Cal looked at Davy. Davy was reading a file very intently and paying no attention to either of them. He sat down. Lyra pulled up the case files and started talking. Cal listened the way he did everything, with full attention and no performance of it. They talked for an hour, wherein at the end of the hour they had a plan for a supply drop on 2 stations that was not officially a supply drop and was definitely a complicated question. Cal said, "You're sure you want to be involved in this?" Lyra said, "I spent 11 months having no involvement in anything." "Yes, I'm sure." He nodded. He said, 6 months to your recertification." She said, "Less if we push." He said, "Then we push." She looked at him, and she said, "Why did you come back after 2 weeks instead of the standard rotation?" He said, "I had a run that came through Port Len." She said, "You rerouted." He said, "The nav analysis showed it was efficient." She said, "Cal." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I wanted to know you were all right." The resettlement office was quiet around them. Davy's plant held its position on the windowsill with the stubborn unremarkableness of a thing that had decided to survive. Lyra said, "I am. Boss, getting there." He said, "Good." They sat in the organized chaos of Davy Oren's office and talked about routes and complicated questions and what the next 6 months looked like. And outside the window, the station turned its slow rotation, and the ships moved in and out of the docking bays, and the stars did what they always did, which was remain exactly themselves, indifferent and permanent and full of distance still to cross. The recertification exam for Navigation Class 3 was administered at Port Len's Transit Authority office on a Tuesday morning, and Lyra passed it by a margin that made the examiner look at her results twice. He was a thorough man named Gort, who had been issuing certifications for 20 years, and who, when he handed her the provisional license, said, "You know these scores qualify you for Class 2 as well." She said, "I know. I'll be back next month for that exam." He said, "I'll be here." The provisional Class 3 license was a thin piece of printed material, standard issue, unremarkable in every physical way. Lyra held it in the corridor outside the Transit Authority office and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. Not happiness exactly. Something more structural than that. The restoration of a weight she had not realized she had been carrying wrong side up. She sent Cal a message. It said, "Passed. Class 3. Next month, Class 2. His response came 4 hours later, which meant he was in deep space with a lag on comms. It said, "Knew you would. Class 2's the hard one. Tell me the date and I'll be in range for comms support the night before." She sent back, "I don't need comms support." He sent, "I know. I want to hear how you're going to explain vector field compensation in Sector 7 to someone who learned to fly from a database. She sent. Badly, he sent, looking forward to it. Lyra stood in the corridor outside the Transit Authority office and felt something move through her that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sound, but was something alive and returning. Like blood coming back into a limb that has been pressed too long against a hard surface. The next 6 weeks were the most structured of her recovery. She worked mornings in Davy's office. She studied for the Class 2 exam in the afternoons. She saw Sarah Voss twice a week, and the sessions moved, as Sarah had predicted, from navigation charts toward harder terrain. And Lyra found that Sarah had been right about the quality of not making things worse, which was rarer than it sounded. There was a session, 4 weeks in, where Lyra described the ambush in full for the first time. Not the compressed minimum, the actual version, with the sequence of events and the choices made, and the one moment where a different decision might have produced a different outcome. Anxera listened and asked exactly one question at the end, which was, "Do you believe you made the wrong choice?" Lyra said, "I believe I made the only choice available given what I knew." Sarah said, "That's a very important distinction." Lyra said, "It doesn't always feel like it." Sarah said, "It will. Not as a feeling, as something more durable than a feeling." The Class 2 exam was on a Thursday morning. Cal was in comms range the night before. Lyra did not need the comms support and did not ask for it. But they talked for 2 hours about Sector 7 vector fields, and at some point stopped talking about navigation and started talking about other things. And when she went to sleep at midnight, she slept cleanly and completely in a way she had not managed after any other exam in her life. She passed Class 2 by an even wider margin than Class 3. The examiner Gort said, "Class 1 is 6 months minimum study," and he said it in the tone of someone stating an obstacle. Lyra said, "I know. I've already started the materials." He looked at her over his reading glasses. He said, "You were a first-class navigator before." She said, "Yes." He said, "Then you're not studying to learn. You're studying to remember." She said, "Yes." He said, "That usually goes faster." The day Lyra passed the Class 2 exam, 3 things happened. Davy processed the successful resettlement of a Crithian family that Lyra had flagged as urgent 11 weeks earlier, and called Lyra to tell her with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been filing difficult paperwork for a long time. Cal arrived at Port Len on a run that was definitely a little rerouted, and Lyra met him at Docking Bay 4 and said, "I want to talk about the co-pilot seat." Cal said, "I thought you might." She said, "Not permanently. I'm on track for Class 1 and I want the exploration certification after that. But there are routes you run that go through sectors with active secondary market activity, and you have been running them alone, which is tactically inefficient." Cal said, "It's been fine." She said, "It has not been fine. I read your incident logs. You had 3 close calls in the last quarter, and all 3 of them were resolved by luck rather than planning." Cal looked at her. He said, "You read my incident logs." And she said, "Davy has access to contractor records." I asked. He said, "Of course you did." They walked up the Ardence ramp together, and Lyra sat in the co-pilot seat, which was where she had left something of herself 6 weeks ago. And she ran her hands over the familiar secondary display and found it exactly as she had set it. She said, "You didn't change my settings." He said, "They were better than mine." They flew the next run together. It was a complicated question in the usual way, a medical supply route that passed through 2 stations where they were not supposed to be, and one handoff that required very precise timing and the kind of calm that comes from having nothing left to prove to anyone. Lyra handled navigation. Cal handled the human element, which apparently meant being extremely relaxed in situations that warranted the opposite, which turned out to be effective in ways she had not anticipated. On the return leg, somewhere in the long quiet of open space, Cal said, "How's the recovery going?" "The real question." She said, "The real question." He said, "You don't have to answer." She looked at the stars through the viewport. She said, "It goes the way these things go. Some days it is architectural. I can see the structure of it and work within the structure. Other days it is not architectural." He said, "What is it on the other days?" She said, "Noise." He said, "And today?" She looked at the nav display. At the course she had plotted, clean and efficient. The three options she had laid out with the kind of detail that required knowing the territory and knowing yourself and knowing who you were flying with. She said, "Today it is architectural." Cal said, "Good." The stars moved past them, indifferent and permanent, full of distance still to cross and full, also, of what was crossing it. The Class 1 exam was not given at Port Len. It was given at the Navigation Authority's regional office on Station Meridian 7, which required a 14-hour transit and a registration fee that made Davy mutter about bureaucratic hostility for 20 minutes before paying it. Lyra took the exam on a Wednesday morning in a room with 11 other candidates and a proctor who had the expression of someone who had failed many people in this room and did not feel bad about it. The exam was 8 hours. Practical navigation simulation, theoretical assessment, emergency protocol response, and a final section that the Navigation Authority called Advanced Sector Judgment, and that Lyra recognized as the section designed to measure whether you had the kind of instinct that could not be fully taught. She finished 40 minutes before time was called. She sat in the quiet of the examination room and looked at her completed work and felt, for the first time, not the returning of something lost, but the presence of something new. The proctor collected her materials. She said, "I'm reviewing the last section. You've done this before." Lyra said, "A long time ago, in different conditions." The proctor said, "The scores will be posted in 3 days." Lyra said, "I know." Cal was waiting in the corridor outside. He had flown to Meridian 7 for no stated reason and had been sitting in the corridor for 8 hours with a book and the same paper cup of something warm that he always seemed to have. He looked up when she came out. She said, "It went well." He said, "I know. You look like it went well." She said, "How do I look when it goes well?" He considered this with the seriousness of someone taking an inventory. He said, "Like someone who stopped trying to get back to where they were and got somewhere else entirely." The scores were posted in 2 days. She passed. First class with distinction. Davy cried briefly and with complete dignity, and then immediately filed 3 applications on Lyra's behalf for exploration class positions, because that was how Davy expressed emotion, and it was. Lyra had come to understand, the most genuine language she had. Sarah Voss, when Lyra told her at their next session, said, "How does it feel?" Lyra said, "It feels like something I built rather than something I recovered." Sarah said, "Yes, that's exactly it." There was a position on a coalition exploration vessel called the Meridian Drift, long range, sector unmapped, crew of 20, departing in 8 weeks. It was the kind of position that required a Class 1 certification and a specific kind of willingness to go toward things that were not yet on any chart. Davy flagged it at the top of the stack. Lyra looked at it for a long time. She thought about the Ardent and the co-pilot's seat, and the complicated questions that Cal ran through sectors where the secondary markets were still operating, and where, she knew, he was still going. Alone in 3 out of 4 runs, she applied for the Meridian Drift position and sent Cal a message the same evening. It said, "Applied for the drift. Departure in 8 weeks. Wanted you to know before I decided." He replied from somewhere with a calm lag. The message came 6 hours later. It said, "It's the right move. The drift does good work in unmapped sectors. You belong on something like that." She replied, "You have 3 close calls per quarter without a navigator." He replied, "I'll be careful." And she replied, "That's not a system." He replied, "I'll figure out a system." She looked at his message for a long time. She sent back, "The incident logs from last quarter are in the secondary nav system. I annotated them. Each close call had a predictable precursor. If you know the pattern, you can see the situation coming 12 minutes earlier than you currently do. Read the annotations." He replied, "I will." She replied, "Promise." He replied, after a shorter lag this time, "Promise." The 8 weeks before departure were the most full she had been since before the ambush. She helped Davy process 11 cases. She completed the exploration track orientation materials. She saw Sarah Voss 6 more times, and in the last session Sarah said, "You don't need to keep coming after this, unless you want to." Lyra said, "You're saying I'm done." Sarah said, "I'm saying the tools are yours now. You know how to use them. What you do with them is your work, not mine." Lyra said, "That's a very efficient way to end a therapeutic relationship." Sarah said, "You're not someone who needs ceremony." Lyra said, "No." She said goodbye to Sarah Voss on a Friday morning and felt, walking out of the office, that the particular weight she had been carrying into those sessions was still there, but was being carried differently, in the body and not across the back. The day before departure, Cal docked at Port Len. He did not have a run that came through Port Len, and he had no logistical reason to be there. He came up the dock with his jacket and his paper cup and said, "I wanted to say goodbye properly." Lyra said, "We spoke 4 days ago on comms." He said, "That's different." They sat in Davy's office, which was Davy's way of being somewhere else while still being present. And they talked for 3 hours about the Meridian Drift's planned sectors and the annotated incident logs and a route correction Lyra had filed with the Port Lene Transit Authority that would reduce the Ardent's transit time on the 3 most common runs by a combined total of 40 hours per quarter. Cal said, "You filed those on my behalf." She said, "You have access to my navigation analysis. I figured the courtesy should run both ways." He said, "Lyra." She looked at him, and he said, "When the drift comes back, you'll have 6 weeks between rotations. The Ardent will be in range." She said, "I know where the Ardent is at any given time." He said, "I know you do." The Ardent, she had noticed, had been running slightly altered courses for the last 2 months. The alterations were minor, small variations in route selection that were not the most efficient options and were not, on any objective measure, explainable by mission requirements. They were, however, consistently variations that brought the Ardent within comms range of wherever Lyra was. She had not mentioned this. She mentioned it now. She said, "Your course variations in the last 8 weeks average a combined extra 6 hours of flight time." Cal looked at the plant on Davy's windowsill. He said, "The nav database I use is slightly outdated." She said, "It is not." He said, "No, it's not." The office was quiet around them. Somewhere in the station, a ship was departing, Us and Lyra could track its trajectory in her mind without thinking about it, a navigator's permanent background awareness of where things were in relation to where she was. She said, 6 weeks between rotations. He said, yes. She said, I'll send coordinates. He said, I'll be there. Lyra stood at Port Lens Docking Bay 7 the next morning, with a standard-issue navigation kit and a bag that was not heavy, because she had learned to travel with only what mattered. Davy was there, dry-eyed and thorough, and pressed a data pad into Lyra's hands that contained the contact frequencies for 11 people across 6 stations that Davy trusted in case of anything, in all the ways that anything can mean. Cal was there. He said nothing, because he was a person who understood the weight of silence and used it correctly. He stood at the edge of the dock with his hands in his jacket and watched her board the Meridian Drift's shuttle. At the top of the ramp, Lyra turned. She looked at Cal Duran, who had walked into a cargo bay on Keth 9 and crouched on the floor in front of a person who had been convinced she was only a number, and who had asked, in badly pronounced Valorian, if that was all right. She said, read the annotations. He said, I will. She said, I mean it. He said, I know. The shuttle ramp closed. The drift pulled away from Port Len and its slow rotation and its stubborn plants and its organized chaos of filed cases. And Lyra sat at the navigator's station of the Meridian Drift and put her hands on the console and felt it recognize her certification and pull up her profile. And the readout said, Navigator Class 1. Lyra, active, ready for assignment. She looked at the stars through the viewport. All that unmapped distance. Ready?